Ah, Wes Anderson. The director whose style is so recognizable yet so severely misunderstood that the man has gone on record saying he hates seeing all these people making AI versions of his style on other movies, as if all there is to his films are symmetry and pretty pastel colors. Sure, many of his films have these, but they have so much more to offer with rich characters, witty dialogue and humor, breathtaking music, intricate and beautifully made sets and scenery, and so much more that shows why he's such a brilliant filmmaker. I think it's a pretty lukewarm take at this point to say that I absolutely love this guy and pretty much every one of his films. I grew up watching a lot of them, and they're a part of the reason why I love films the way I do today. So in celebration of his newest film, Asteroid City's release, I figured why not go into his filmography as a whole and see how they compare to one another and how his style of filmmaking has adapted and evolved over the past almost 3 decades now. But to do so, we must start at the bottom and work our way up, which means...
You don't love me! Yes, I do!
I love you too, but I'm gonna mace you in the face! Stop!
I never thought I'd live to see the day where I called a Wes Anderson film boring, but here we are. I had seen a surprising amount of positive reviews and discussion about this film on Letterboxd before watching it, so I got a bit excited and thought, maybe I'll surprisingly love this film like a lot of other people do. And after watching it, I have to say, I'm not one of those people. First, I must make it clear that just because this is at the bottom of the list and I didn't love it as much as his other films, doesn't mean I think this is a bad film in any stretch of the imagination. I can understand why some may love it, and there's plenty to like about it. Adrian Brody, Jason Schwartzman, and Owen Wilson all play their roles extremely well here, and the set designs both on the train and off were great. But apart from that, I didn't really find anything else about it all that great, and it definitely didn't hit me emotionally like a lot of his other movies do. Ironically, it wasn't until about halfway through when the brothers were kicked off the titular train that I actually began to like the film. I liked a lot of the quiet moments that they had, like when they were sitting in the desert and listening to French music around a campfire, or when they were attending the funeral of the drowned boy that they couldn't save. And honestly, I kinda wish that the film would have kicked them off sooner so that there could have been more scenes like that. Though as is, while definitely his weakest film, it's still pretty decent and fairly charming, though it just wasn't really for me.
Let's move, come on! A bigger one, you idiot! What do you think?
Don't call me an idiot, you punk.
Do you have bigger bags for atlases or dictionaries, sir?
Bottle Rocket is by far the least Wes Anderson film, if that makes sense. Which, considering that this is his first feature film, isn't all that surprising. The plot here is extremely simple and a bit vague, with the 3 main characters trying to become successful criminals seemingly because they have nothing better to do. And honestly, most of the legwork comes from the characters and how they interact with one another, and admittedly most of them aren't particularly interesting. However, what truly saves this film for me is Owen Wilson's character Dignan. He's just such an entertaining wannabe criminal, and it's so funny to see all of these plans that he makes that don't go well because they weren't that well thought out, and the moments where he blows up at people only to apologize and be all quiet and polite are always great. I mean, there's a scene where he's just being so polite and saying stuff like, just do your best and thank you so much to the people who work at the bookstore he's robbing. It just never fails to make me laugh. I also love the part where he devises a whole escape plan for Anthony because he doesn't know that the mental hospital Anthony was staying at was a voluntary one. And when Anthony convinces the head doctor to go along with it because Dignan was so excited about it, now that's real friendship right there. In fact, I probably would have liked the film a lot more if it was just focused on these two and their heists, but the whole middle section at the motel where Anthony falls in love with one of the maids really killed my interest and made the film a lot more boring and melodramatic than it needed to be. Fortunately, it gets back to being a heist movie at the end, and what an entertaining ending that was. Thank you, Dignan, for being a true friend, even if it meant getting yourself sent to prison at the end. So while this isn't an amazing film overall, I did somewhat like it, and it honestly isn't too bad of a start for Wes Anderson's career, as well as a solid foundation for the creative and innovative techniques he would later develop.
Mais c'est une espèce en voie de disparition. Pourquoi vouloir la tuer?
That's an endangered species at most. What would be the scientific purpose of killing it?
Revenge.
Out of the entirety of Wes Anderson's filmography, The Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou is by far the one that I have the most mixed feelings about, because on one hand, this movie has a lot that I liked about it, but on the other, there was also a lot that I didn't like about it. Starting off positive, I absolutely adored the unique look that this film had compared to many of his others. I like how many of the scenes here were filmed in the style of a documentary, and how the entire film seems to be inspired by the works of Jacques Cousteau, right down to his iconic blue shirt and red hat being the standard uniform for everyone on board the Belafonte. I also absolutely loved how all the animals in this film were done in excellent stop motion by the endlessly talented Henry Selick. It gave the film a sort of realistic, fantastical element that a lot of his films have, and so many of these creatures are so beautifully designed and animated that it was by far my favorite aspect of the film. However, while many of the technical and aesthetic aspects of this film were really good, the actual plot itself was fairly lacking for me. I got hooked pretty quickly at first seeing the titular Steve Zissou pronounce his plot to hunt down the shark that killed his best friend that may or may not actually even exist and make it the sequel to his latest documentary. But then the film begins to meander a bit and stumble between characters, so it becomes unclear who is even meant to be the focus of the film, and for every scene that kept me interested and invested in the overarching plot, there were at least 2 more that made me start to space out and absolutely killed my interest in the film. I will give The Life Aquatic this though. The ending was absolutely beautiful, both visually and emotionally, and the music that went along with it was absolutely breathtaking, as was the music throughout the rest of the film for that matter. I particularly enjoyed the French covers of David Bowie's songs sung throughout the entire film. Maybe after a rewatch or two, this movie will grow on me, but for now, it was alright, but I wouldn't exactly call it an underrated masterpiece like so many other people do.
A rancid apple core, 2 worm-eaten banana peels, a moldy rice cake, a dried-up pickle, tin of sardine, bones, a pile of broken eggshells, an old smushed-up rotten gizzard with maggots all over it.
Okay, it's worth it.
When I first saw the trailer for Wes Anderson's second stop-motion animated film Isle of Dogs several years ago, I was really excited for it, and after I saw it, I really liked it. Though after a couple more viewings, it definitely began to drop in quality for me, and now, like The Life Aquatic, I'm kind of mixed on how I feel about it. Unsurprisingly, the best part of Isle of Dogs is the animation, which is so well crafted and gorgeous to look at that it makes this film easily one of his best looking. I mean, just look at this scene of a man making sushi. Just the amount of effort and detail put into this scene that's barely a minute long is insane to me, and every time I see it, I genuinely get hungry for some. And that's just the tip of the iceberg for the animation here, with so many great details like how the fights in this movie, both between dogs and humans, are covered in clouds like it's an old cartoon, to even little things like how you could see the dog's fur move in the breeze in some scenes. They didn't have to go through so much effort just for these little details, but they did, and I give them serious props for it. There's also a lot of great cinematography here, with a lot of wide shots and creative uses of light and shadow that are really pretty to look at, as well as some really good long tracking shots, which any Wes Anderson fan knows are the bread and butter of his filmography. However, despite the absolutely beautiful visuals present here, the actual plot and characters were somewhat lacking, mainly because the only character who's given any real focus is the dog Chief, voiced by Bryan Cranston. The other characters are alright, I guess, but there are just way too many of them to get invested in, and while some are fine enough like the other 4 dogs and Atari, the little boy who goes searching for his dog on Trash Island, there are just others that are really odd to me, like the villain who just completely changes his mind about his hatred of dogs out of nowhere, and the foreign exchange student who could be removed from the story entirely and little about it would change. Sorry, Greta Gerwig. I also got the vibe that this wasn't exactly the most accurate or in-depth depiction of Japan, but considering that I am not Japanese nor have I ever set foot in the country, I can't say that for certain, nor can I really judge the film too harshly based on that alone. Though to me, it definitely seems like it's more of a tourist guide to Japan rather than that of an expert. And there's a lot more that I could say about Isle of Dogs, but for the sake of everyone's time, I think I might just make a whole video about this film sometime later down the line.
I like your nurse's uniform, guy.
These are OR scrubs.
Oh, are they?
Besides Bottle Rocket, the Wes Anderson film that I knew the least about was his second project, Rushmore, and after seeing it, I have to say that I really liked it. The film handles the whole student having a crush on their teacher trope very well and successfully avoids making the whole thing really creepy, though it does come a little close at times with how stalkery and clingy the main character Max gets about his teacher. Like, for real, Max comes very close to being a completely unlikable little twerp to me, but he has enough great acting and hilarious lines that I can't really bring myself to hate him that much. Luckily, the film eventually puts less focus on Max's unrequited love for Miss Cross and more on the absolutely hilarious feud between Max and his business associate turned friend turned bitter rival Herman Bloom, and the lengths these 2 idiots go to get back at one another is absolutely amazing to watch, like how Bloom runs Max's bike over out of revenge, only for Max to respond by cutting the goddamn brakes to his car, with the whole montage being played alongside The Who's A Quick One While He's Away being an amazing touch to this already amazing scene. However, I do somewhat wish that Miss Cross actually had a bit more personality to her, considering that the whole conflict of the film is centered around her. And I do think that it was a little weird that at the end of the film, Max got together with the girl that he was treating like shit the whole time. But these things don't really bother me too much, since this is still an absolute delight of a film to watch, and seeing Max's ridiculous plans and absolute stubbornness lead to his surprise successes is always entertaining.
You were very good in the one about the tramp in the brothel who gets amnesia and becomes a pediatrician. You were very authentic.
Actually, maybe my favorite character I've ever
I don't know why nobody else liked it.
Oh, yes. Me neither. Thank you.
Asteroid City is Wes Anderson's newest film, and after seeing it in the theater, I absolutely loved it. I really liked the bright color palette that this movie had, and the performances were very solid all across the board, with especially great performances from Jason Schwartzman and Scarlett Johansson. And a shout out to this movie for being the first good movie that Tom Hanks has been in since he appeared as himself in the Borat sequel. Something I especially liked about Asteroid City was that it was a very grounded and character-driven film, like many of his earlier works. Sure, there's an alien that comes down to their little town which causes the government to place everyone under lockdown, but I like how the film focuses more on how these people react to these events rather than the events themselves. The whole subplot of Augie and his family dealing with their grief and the little girls burying their mother's ashes in the desert to try and bring her back to life is really well done and can be a bit of a sucker punch emotionally, but that's a good thing if you ask me, because I wouldn't want it any other way. I also like how a lot of this film was done with practical effects rather than bland CGI. It gives the film a lot more personality and that sort of indie vibe that makes his other films so great, even when they were long past the indie status. Like, obviously the laser gun and the jetpack were going to have some CGI involved, but then there are so many cool things that were done with practical effects, like how the Roadrunner that's in a bunch of scenes was actually a puppet controlled by two different people, or especially how the alien that shows up halfway through is made of stop motion animation so smooth that you could have convinced me that it was just regular 3D animation. Though I'm not sure how I feel about the second narrative that this film has, that being about the production of the play that would be called Asteroid City. This plot is interesting on paper, but just the way that it's split apart and spliced into the rest of the film was a little odd, and it could be a bit jarring at times since it would absolutely kill the pacing of the film. However, it is clever how they implemented the idea of it being a play into the film itself, with the backgrounds and scenery looking like matte paintings and many of the landmarks looking plastic like they're pieces on a set. I'm sure that I'll enjoy this framing device and the film as a whole more when I rewatch it, since then I'll be able to pick up on a lot of the little details and foreshadowing that I probably missed. But as of right now, it's still an absolutely great film that I had a great time with. It's a very strong 8 out of 10, so go watch it, but be warned that it does spoil the ending of Oppenheimer for you.
Kotak, what's all this lumber for?
We're building a treehouse.
Where?
Right here.
That's not a safe altitude. Why is it up so high? If someone falls from there, that's a guaranteed death.
Well, where would you have built it?
Lower.
Moonrise Kingdom is probably Wes Anderson's simplest film in terms of plot and characters, but honestly that's by far one of the best aspects of it to me. Rather than it being a film that has a lot that I like about it and a lot that I didn't like about it, this one is just a constant stream of great filmmaking and scenes that just really put me in a good mood while I watch it. I mean, there is a reason that so many of Wes's most recognizable and iconic shots came from this film. The cinematography and lighting are just on another level here and help make this film as great as it is. As for the characters, I really like how Sam and Susie were written. They are children, but aren't written as idiots or as annoying little shits. The film acknowledges that these kids can be very emotionally mature and thoughtful, yet at the same time the film doesn't just write them as adults in kids' bodies. They act on impulses without thinking, they make mistakes, and they don't really think about the potential consequences or unrealistic expectations of their actions. And this is a really tough balancing act for writing child characters that is rarely done right, but here it passes with flying colors. I also like how the adults who try to stop their romance aren't evil maniacal assholes. They're just worried parents and guardians who truly care about their kids but just don't know how to show it. Except for the social services lady, she can go fuck herself for trying to send Sam to electroshock therapy. Most of their actions are justifiable and understandable, and I want to give a special shout out to Captain Sharp for being one of the best characters in any of Wes Anderson's films. The scene where he offers to adopt Sam is absolutely amazing and heartwarming, and that's honestly how I describe the film as a whole.
You son of a bitch! God damn!
That's the last time you put a knife in me. Hear me?
There's a lot that I can say about the Royal Tenenbaums, but I think that for now what I want to talk about it is that I'm not sure if there's any other film of his, and few films at all for that matter, that make me feel the way this one does. Maybe it's because of personal experiences or how the plot and characters are written in such a way that pretty much anyone can relate to this film on some level, but the characters present here are some of Wes Anderson's most layered and interesting, which is great considering there's very little real plot to the film, instead focusing on the Tenenbaum family, their different ways of dealing with their problems, and how they interact with one another. The writing here is also great, with the film having a lot of lighthearted and funny moments that then halt and occasionally hit you in the gut with some extraordinarily sad and dark scenes. And for a lesser film, this could have very easily killed the pacing of the story and damaged the film as a whole, but The Royal Tenenbaums is not a lesser film. It weaves the two tones together beautifully and maturely so that the family's dynamic and interactions with one another truly feels realistic and not like some awful soap opera that would do the same plot of a dad faking being ill, only infinitely worse. Speaking of those sucker punch moments, oh my god, they are so expertly handled and beautifully done. I mean, it might be a little weird for me to say this, but one of my favorite scenes of the whole film is the one where Richie attempts to kill himself. Just the way it's shot, framed, lit, and how the music plays over it is so amazing, yet so heartbreaking. And at the end where Chaz says, "I had a rough year, Dad," it's just so fucking sad and powerful. It always hits me right where I live. And that's just a handful of the powerful scenes and line deliveries here. It's all great stuff, you know? I also think this film does really well as a criticism of the idea of labeling kids as inherently gifted. Chaz, Margot, and Richie are all labeled as geniuses as children and raised around the idea that they were brilliant and destined to do greater things, and as this idea often does, it ultimately hurt the children as they grew into adulthood. However, this notion also damaged Richie's friend across the street, Eli, who wanted all his life to be a Tenenbaum even though on the inside the Tenenbaum family was a complete mess. Just like how the gifted kid concept can negatively impact the kids who aren't labeled as gifted. Maybe I'm just reading a little bit too much into this film, but the fact that their parents and journalists and whatnot call them brilliant and gifted several times made me notice it, and I find it a little unlikely that it's just a coincidence. I'm also pretty sure that it was the Royal Tenenbaums that made me love the type of film where there isn't really an overarching plot, but rather just smaller vignettes that focus on the characters, especially in masterpieces like Lady Bird and the Meyerowitz stories, which I think takes a lot of inspiration from this film. So it gets bonus points for that.
A message from the foreman. 1 hour to press.
You're fired.
Really?
Don't cry in my office.
Maybe it's because of the episodic format that this movie decides to use to tell its stories, but many seem to feel that The French Dispatch is one of Wes Anderson's weakest films, if not the weakest of his entire filmography. And I am not one of those people. I absolutely loved nearly every aspect of this film, from the huge and varied star-studded cast that all gave amazing performances, to the amazing score and songs that were played here, to especially the cinematography, lighting, editing, and basically every other visual aspect of this film. I had seen very few films before that experiment with its use of cinematography quite like this one does, and how many of the scenes in this film jump from black and white to color to black and white again truly drives home the impact that fine art, young love, and a well-cooked meal can have on a person and the world around them. I also enjoyed the episodic stories for this film, since I thought they all served their own separate purposes of giving life to the city of Ennui, France, and it works really well since I can't say I can think of any other Wes Anderson film where the city has just as much personality as the people who live in it. Speaking of these stories, my personal favorite is The Concrete Masterpiece by Tilda Swinton's character J.K.L. Berenson, who is based on the real French art journalist Rosamond Bernier. The art featured here was surprisingly great, and the whole plot of the prisoner Moses Rosenthaler struggling to find motivation to keep painting, only to get back at the art dealer who forces him to keep painting by making 10 frescoes on the prison walls was absolutely hilarious. I honestly could have watched a whole separate film about this, though as is, it's still absolutely amazing to watch. Of course, this isn't to say that the other two stories weren't good. Revision to a Manifesto by Lucinda Cremens was great and had some really creative uses of set design and cinematography, and the college students' revolution was very entertaining to see. As for The Private Dining Room of the Police Commissioner by Roebuck Wright, the story was just so ridiculous that you just couldn't help but go along for the ride, and seeing the chef poison all of the kidnappers in order to save the commissioner's son was amazing. I also loved the segments that were animated in a simple cartoon style, and honestly between this and some brief moments where we see it in Isle of Dogs, I would have loved to see a whole film by Wes using this style. So in short, this is by far Wes Anderson's most underrated film, and I can't wait to see more people come to love this movie the way that I do when it inevitably gains the title of cult classic like many of his earlier films.
Why is he wearing that bandit hat? His ears were cold. He's not with us. Go back to bed.
If what I think is happening, it better not be.
This should come as no surprise to anybody who knows me personally. Fantastic Mr. Fox is by far one of my favorite animated films of all time, and I would definitely put it somewhere in my top 20 favorite films in general. Like Isle of Dogs, the animation in this movie is absolutely stellar, and there's so much detail and life brought into these little critters. Though honestly, I think I prefer the animation here to the animation in Isle of Dogs for several reasons. For one, I vastly prefer the anthropomorphic character designs here since it lets the characters show a lot more emotion and be able to do a lot more visually interesting things than they would be able to if they were just normal animals. I also really like how this film really drives home the fact that these characters are animals and not just furry little people, which a lot of movies about anthropomorphic animals are often guilty of. Sure, they speak English, go to school, read newspapers, and do all sorts of things that humans do, but at the same time, they live in burrows and trees that are just decorated like human homes. They eat their food savagely with their hands like the wild animals that they are, and when they get into arguing matches, it just slowly devolves into them just hissing and growling at each other, which is absolutely hilarious to see and can surprisingly contribute to the film's central themes as well. However, what truly sets us ahead of Isle of Dogs in terms of the animation is the designs of the humans. There, the people look very simplistic with monotone colors and stiff movements, except for Majordomo. I absolutely love his Frankenstein-looking ass. In Fantastic Mr. Fox, however, there's so much detail and personality in the human designs, especially in the case of the film's villains, Bogus, Bunce, and Bean. These three farmers all pass the silhouette test with flying colors, and on top of being terrifically designed, they're also hilarious and probably my favorite villains of Wes Anderson's entire filmography. I absolutely loved seeing these mad bastards growing more and more obsessed with this fox stealing their food and going to more and more drastic lengths in order to catch him. This is also probably Wes Anderson's funniest film, with so many well-written scenes and great visual gags, and every actor absolutely killed it in their performances. I mean, obviously George Clooney and Meryl Streep did an excellent job playing their characters Mr. and Mrs. Fox with so many amazingly funny line deliveries, but the fact that I didn't even recognize Jason Schwartzman as Ash just shows how good he was at playing a child character. I mean, seriously, I've been watching this movie for years now, and I only just noticed this on my most recent viewing. So yeah, this is by far one of Wes's best films, and one that I can watch over and over again without ever getting tired of it. Just like Isle of Dogs, I could make a whole separate video on this film, though I'm pretty sure that it would be a lot more positive than the Isle of Dogs one.
If I learn you ever once laid a finger on my mother's body, living or dead, I swear to God I'll cut your throat.
You hear me? I thought I was supposed to be a fucking faggot.
You are, but you're bisexual.
You know how I just said that Fantastic Mr. Fox was Wes Anderson's funniest film? Well...
That fucking faggot!
Yeah, this is actually the funniest film he's ever made. I mean, what is there even to say that hasn't already been said about the Grand Budapest Hotel? How is it even possible for a film this good to be made by us mere mortals? Literally every aspect of what makes a film great can be seen being put to amazing use here, from its breathtaking cinematography and lighting, to its clever and hilarious writing, to the score, which is genuinely one of the greatest scores ever put to film ever, from the extremely talented Alexandre Desplat. I mean, there is a reason that this film is so universally loved by pretty much every film critic on Earth and is often called his magnum opus. Well, that and because it is. On top of nearly every technical aspect of this film being amazing, the film has outstanding performances from the entirety of its star-studded cast, with Edward Norton, Adrian Brody, Jeff Goldblum, and F. Murray Abraham giving great performances as their respective characters. However, I must shine a particular spotlight on the film's leads Tony Revolori as Zero and Ralph Fiennes as Gustav H. The two have an amazing chemistry and play off of one another extremely well as giving really good performances on their own. I mean, how is it even possible for Ralph Fiennes to have this much range and conviction in just this film alone, not even mentioning all of his other roles as well compared to this? I have loved this film ever since I was a little kid, and every time I watch it, I find a new thing that I never noticed about it on any of my previous rewatches, and my love for the film grows even larger. You know how I also said that the Fantastic Mr. Fox would probably be somewhere in my top 20 favorite films? Well, the Grand Budapest Hotel is probably in my top 10, and it's been in there for longer than any other film that I've ever seen, and I don't see it going anywhere anytime soon. This will forever be one of my go-to comfort movies and the definitive Wes Anderson movie, and I will continue to celebrate the Grand Budapest Hotel until the day I die.